And again, number 1 and 2 on the leaderboard for championship points, but no one else seems to be trying to pick up on this team, which of course does have the Amoonguss, the Rapid Strike Urshifu, King Gambit, Dragonite, Hearthflame Ogerpon, and Chen Pao. He will be facing off against Paul Chua, who, this is kind of a bonkers matchup. Joe Ugarte versus Paul Chua for their winning in at the biggest regional in history. Yeah, that seems right.
I mean, these are two players who could easily find themselves in the finals tomorrow. So with this being an elimination matchup is absolutely intense. And we'll talk about Paul's team as we go into this game number 1, because these players are already good to go.
Yeah, they are ready for this. And that's going to be Raging Bolt and the Wellspring Ogerpon on Paul's side up against the Amoonguss and the Hearthflame Ogerpon on Joe's. So the booster energy coming out from Raging Bolt indicating that is not going to hold the safety goggles that you sometimes see. It is instead the Grass Terra type to protect against sleeves from the Amoonguss, but of course you do still have Follow Me on that Wellspring Amoonguss, able to block the Spore as well. So this Amoonguss not really too effective at the moment.
Not really effective at all. And what I find really curious about this start from both these trainers is that Ogerpon is really the Pokemon that's going to want to do damage here, and we'll see Joe go for that with a Power Whip into the Spiky Shield off of the Ogerpon Wellspring on Paul's side of the field. Will get some recoil damage from that Spiky Shield, and we do see Spore try to connect with the Raging Bolt. So that is a great tournament information for Paul, knowing that there was an attempt at putting that Raging Bolt to sleep, but now it seems like it's very easy for him to just click Follow Me on that Ogerpon. It's going to take neutral damage or from any of the attacks from this Hearthflame Ogerpon on Joe's side of the field, and that'll give this Raging Bolt an opportunity to either go for damage or set up. Paul is running the Calm Mind variant on that Raging Bolt, and this seems like a great opportunity to go for it, but instead just resisting the damage outright.
Wow, even with a critical hit, that Raging Bolt able to tank that Ivy Cudgel coming out from the Hearthflame Ogerpon. The Wellspring Ogerpon fires back with an Ivy Cudgel of its own, which is then followed up by a Dragon Pulse from the Raging Bolt. So Joe's Ogerpon will go down. However, there was no Follow Me, there was no Terastallization, which means that the Spore does connect with the Raging Bolt. So trading the Hearthflame Ogerpon for a sleep on the Raging Bolt, there will be at least one turn now where that Pokemon is not able to move.
I think that was a fair trade for Joe, if only because had there been a Terastallization there to try and avoid being put to sleep, that Ivy Cudgel would have picked up the KO on that Raging Bolt easily. Even a redirection there would have probably put this Ogerpon within knockout range of something like a Sucker Punch, especially now that we see the Chen Pao next to the King Gambit, like we've seen Joe pivot to so many times.
Well, another turn where this Raging Bolt is blowing a turn of sleep, and Ivy Cudgel into that King Gambit. The Chen Pao actually working a little bit against it. That is now a 2-hit KO on the King Gambit, and the Kowtow Cleave doesn't quite pick up the KO on Raging Bolt, which means that Paul still has an opportunity to potentially attack with that Pokemon.
Yeah, and going for a Spiky Shield here as well to try and buy as much time possible for this Raging Bolt. Great, too, because those Sucker Punches, no attacking moves.
No attacking moves, and the Raging Bolt is still asleep. So the Spiky Shield dodging both of those Sucker Punches, and that Raging Bolt also potentially going for a Calm Mind there. So no Sucker Punches.
I know. I wish we could have seen the targeting there, because that could have very well have been double Sucker Punch into that Ogerpon Wellspring to try and pick up the knockout. But instead, the Ogerpon still has the option to go for Follow Me this turn if it wants to avoid a double Sucker Punch play. I don't think that's something that Joe can comfortably click back-to-back. Instead, I think he has to focus back to maybe the Ice Spinner on that Chen Pao to try and pick up the remaining amount of damage. But we're getting our first Terastallization of the match, and it's going to be that King Gambit.
Yeah, King Gambit is now a Dragon type, which means it will resist further Ivy Cudgels coming out from that Wellspring Ogerpon, but does make it vulnerable to a Dragon Pulse from Raging Bolt. But Paul has now taken a full 3 turns of sleep, and the King Gambit Sucker Punch connects with the Ogerpon. The Ice Spinner from Chen Pao will also connect with the Ogerpon. So with 3 turns of sleep, Raging Bolt just taking a nap while its partner buddy Ogerpon goes down.
And looking at how the turn order went there, I feel like the Raging Bolt, I don't think it's naturally faster than that Qianpao. That had to have been a Thunderclap there, maybe trying to target down the King Gambit or the Qianpao, really. But it is guaranteed to wake up this turn, which means, especially at such low health, I think you have to go for that Thunderclap to try and pick up some damage, but going to be resisted by the King Gambit, and now with the Amoonguss returning to the field as well, that's another slot where that damage just would not convert.
Well, the Amoonguss back on the field, Qianpao running in fear of this Flutter Mane, which is going to go ahead and terrestrialize into the Fairy type. This King Gambit, now Dragon type, is even more scared of the Flutter Mane, unable to actually threaten it with Sucker Punch just yet, so it has to protect in the face of this Pokemon. Raging Bolt finally wakes up, but the Thunderclap is going to whiff on the switch and into the Protect, while this Dazzling Gleam will deal some damage, but kind of negligible to the Amoonguss on the switch end.
This is going to be a Choice Specs Flutter Mane, which means regardless of a Rage Powder from the Amoonguss, that attack is going to connect with the King Gambit this turn. You could try and get a double Protect, but realistically speaking, that doesn't necessarily buy you enough time in this matchup. It's better to lock in your KO against the opposing Raging Bolt, and then hopefully Amoonguss can find a way to put this Flutter Mane to sleep.
Well, it can definitely do that by tanking a Dazzling Gleam. Will pick up the KO on King Gambit, but Joe got an incredible amount of value out of that Pokemon, actually dealing good damage to both the Ogerpon and the Raging Bolt, and finally picking up the KO on the Raging Bolt this turn, while Amoonguss spores the Flutter Mane, which means Qianpao gets to come back in, which means Qianpao is going to be next to this Amoonguss, can protect itself with Rage Powder from whatever the fourth Pokemon Paul Chua has brought, which is going to be the Incineroar. Actually, probably the best possible Pokemon for Paul to have brought in this matchup.
Yeah, the other thing that's really interesting about this matchup right now is just how quickly these players are playing. You know, Paul Chua is a player that I feel like I consistently have to watch the timers on because he will take the maximum amount of time to think through his moves.
Not today.
Both these players are just flying.
Well, there's the Sacred Sword into the Incineroar, not dealing a lot of damage after that Intimidate. Flare Blitz will pick up the KO on Amoonguss, which means Joe is going to need at least another 3-turn sleep from that Flutter Mane, and likely even more help from the Sacred Sword, potentially a critical hit to get this Incineroar off the field.
I know, that damage was so close in the previous turn. That Incineroar is sitting at about 40% of its health. We saw it do about 30, but he was able to get the damage thanks to the Flare Blitz recoil in particular. But that is still a Flutter Mane with the Fairy-type Terrestrialization at full health. So Qianpao will need to connect one attack with this Flutter Mane before it could be in knockout range from a Sucker Punch.
Flutter Mane is awake, will bring this Qianpao down to its Focus Sash. This Ice Spinner, though, coming out from Qianpao will deal big damage, and then locked into Choice Specs. Finally getting that KO on the Incineroar could have been huge, but I don't think that's enough damage.
It's so close here. It's resisted damage, and it is not enough. It was the Intimidate ultimately from that Incineroar that gave Paul the win condition. I think it was great how Joe tried to play around that, going for the Ice Spinner first. That attack would deal the most damage to that Flutter Mane, but just could not match the speed of that Pokemon at the end.
Yeah, incredible match there. Joe almost clutched it out, needed one more turn of sleep on that Flutter Mane to get the win, but did not get the full double 3 turns of sleep on both the Raging Bolt and the Flutter Mane. So clearly that Amoonguss is going to be a key piece for Joe. And yeah, wow, those players both knew exactly what they wanted to do on every single turn of the game. And fellas, you know your timer doesn't carry over into game 2. You can take a little bit of time to think.
I know. And again, both these players are very, notorious for taking their time. So just to see them commit so quickly to the Pokemon that they're going to bring in this matchup, to the moves they're going to be using, it does make me wonder just how experienced they are playing this archetype. We've seen Joe run this team, Riley as well, his own variant of it, for several events now. So it's definitely something on Paul Chua's radar to practice against. And even Chua's team, I feel like, is the very comfortable earlier metagame take on Raging Bolt, where you run it alongside of these more tried and true partners in order to find your outs.
Yeah.
Going into game number 2, I do like your call out about the Amoonguss, but I have to wonder if it's comfortable to rely on that Pokemon Sleep in particular a second time around. Just because sleep is variable, and yes, Sport is guaranteed to connect and put that Pokemon to sleep, but I do worry about, getting the number of sleep turns you need in order to play to those outs. I think Joe would be better off keeping the Amoonguss more as a Rage Powder user, and then maybe pivoting to something like a Dragonite that's going to be easier to resist the damage coming out from everything minus the Flutter Mane, and then just have a little bit more of a game plan for that final Pokemon.
Yeah, I like the shout for Dragonite because we saw the King Gambit Terra into the Dragon type just to try to resist the Ogerpon damage.
Yeah.
But then it was just so weak to Flutter Mane and was nothing that Joe could do and didn't actually get any value out of it. The next attack was a Flutter Mane Dazzling Gleam. But here we go into game 2, and things are looking a little bit better if you are a Joe Ugarte fan, because King Gambit has just caught a Defiant boost off of that Incineroar. And next to Chien Pao means that these Sucker Punches, these Kowtow Cleaves, these Iron Heads will deal big damage to anything that has the misfortune of being struck by them.
Unfortunately for Joe, though, he is in a position where a Flare Blitz from that Incineroar could do some big damage. Obviously, Joe knows how his King Gambit has been trained. It's possible that maybe it could take one attack from the Incineroar, but if that Raging Bolt decides to double into that Pokemon, will it be able to survive? It looks like for now, it's only that Incineroar that's going to be attacking this turn.
Well, Ice Spinner will hit into the Protect of the Raging Bolt that decided not to attack this turn at all. Here comes the Flare Blitz, connects with the King Gambit.
Oh.
Huge damage, not enough to pick up the KO, but the burn! That's going to make all of that Defiant boost worthless, cutting the attack in half as Kowtow Cleave will connect with the Incineroar, dealing pitiful damage after the burn. Plus the chip means there's only one more turn for that King Gambit on the field no matter what.
That is such an unfortunate turn of events for Joe. Like you were saying, burn will just have the amount of damage that you are doing at the end of that calculation. So you just do not benefit from the Defiant boost anymore, and really even sort of Ruin isn't necessarily helping you out at this point, given how little damage that did. It's possible that this King Gambit could have gotten one more Sucker Punch in, but Paul just correctly going Thunderclap into that slot to ensure there was no chance of that happening.
Yeah, Paul not allowing any additional residual damage to come through from that King Gambit, and the Ice Spinner only dealing about 50% to the Raging Bolt thanks to the Intimidate from the Incineroar. That U-turn dealing about 50% probably puts that Chien Pao in range of a Thunderclap as Ogerpon comes in favor of the Incineroar. Also being able to redirect any damage coming out from the Chien Pao, keeping that Raging Bolt very, very healthy.
One benefit for Joe's positioning in this match compared to the previous one is that he hasn't gone for his Terastallization yet, so he does have the option to power up his Ogerpon and give it a +1 in its attack thanks to that Hearthflame Mask and the Embody Aspect ability. I think he's really going to have to rely on that, especially knowing that there is an Incineroar in the back that could come in and intimidate at any point in time.
Well, Amoonguss will switch in for the Chien Pao. Chien Pao trying to reset that attack, like you mentioned, afraid of the Incineroar, also weakened thanks to the U-turn. Both Ogerpon on the field, just going to go ahead and the Spiky Shield on this turn, which gives a turn for Raging Bolt to go for a Thunderclap. But once again, no attacks made on this turn. Amoonguss switching in and both Ogerpons protecting.
Both Ogerpon protecting as well means that Joe will have to attack with his Ogerpon this turn, because I don't think this is necessarily a opportunity for you to take that 30% chance to go for the double Spiky Shield. He's already down a lot. He needs to find his footing here, and with Incineroar coming in again to intimidate that Ogerpon, it's going to be that much harder.
Well, Incineroar back on the field, dropping the attack of the Ogerpon. No Follow Me coming out from Paul, which means that this Stomping Tantrum will connect. Deals a decent amount of damage. The Ivy Cudgel, a critical hit! That's a one-hit KO. Joe is not getting any of the rolls here. This Pollen Puff will fail, trying to target down the Hearthflame Ogerpon, keep it healthy, but that critical hit means no can do. Incineroar on the field against Chen Pao and Amoonguss, and this is an extremely strong position for Paul. Seems really difficult for Joe to get out of this one.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate for Joe that the burn in that first turn and the critical hit on that Ogerpon as well has really given Paul such a leg up in this matchup. But it does feel like on paper, Paul just has the Pokemon that he needs to play through this, and it feels so much easier for him to find the positioning he needs in this matchup compared to Joe, where he's constantly having to maneuver around what Paul's bringing to the field.
Yeah, and Paul even just flinching the Amoonguss there with Fake Out, knowing that Chen Pao is going to be too scared to do anything. Amoonguss does have the ability to Terrastalize into the Water type to resist a Flare Blitz coming out from the Incineroar, but really going to be difficult. There's not a lot of damage from that Amoonguss, and Chen Pao just going for a double protect that fails. Not going to be able to clutch this one out. It looks like another critical hit for good measure from that Ogerpon. Ogerpon, you're supposed to do that against the Loyal 3, not the Treasures of Ruin. But it looks like Ogerpon is just angry today, and Incineroar's U-turn will be able to switch back out, and Paul gets to choose which Pokemon he wants to be out on the field to win this match and make it to day 2.
That was such a tough call for Joe in that previous turn as well, because if you go for the Terrastalization plus the Rage Powder, you're not going to be able to redirect that Ogerpon's attack regardless, because it is still part Grass type. So at the end of the day, you would have only been redirecting the Flare Blitz, which really would have knocked out that Chen Pao regardless. So very well played. Unfortunately for Joe, this just is not his weekend. But there will be more Pokemon tournaments for sure, and it's possible, depending on how he finishes,